Welcome to Talking the Whiz Quiz, an HR guide to drug and alcohol testing. We are Gary and Lori Oschmann with AZC Drug Testing. Today, our topic we're going to talk about is random testing and consortiums. So, Gary, what is random testing?
Random testing is testing without notice. U.S. Department of Transportation does require every employee to be included in every draw if they are safety-sensitive employees. Even if that employee was previously selected, Department of Transportation does require that the selection use a scientifically valid method of random testing. I ran into a carrier many years ago that was cited by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration because what they used to do was during a driver's meeting, they would throw all the drivers' names in a hat and have one of the drivers walk up to the front of the room and draw out names. And DOT auditor said that is not scientifically valid because what if there's a slight difference in the size of each slip?
Most people are doing random testing. They're using like a computer software type program that has been approved and considered scientifically proven.
Yes, scientifically valid. And we do see, some non-regulated, companies that can vary this a little bit, because with DOT, you have to use that scientifically valid. Non-regulated, could I exclude somebody from a draw? I could. Or I can state what types of employees are included, that it's only this classification in non-regulated, whereas Department of Transportation is anybody that the US DOT, that mode determines is a safety-sensitive employee.
Okay. So why do random testing? What's the purpose?
One of the biggest purposes is it's a deterrent. It keeps employees diligent, keeps them from, maybe that is their excuse for not doing it. But it's basically it promotes safety. It keeps, the workplace safe, with periodic testing. They said for federally regulated testing, it is mandated for those DOT safety sensitive roles. Then of course some companies for their drug-free program have contracts or insurance requirements that may dictate that they do random testing.
Right, we definitely see that a lot with some of our clients.
And then also when there is known or suspected problems in the workplace, companies that implement that random program helps weed out the problems, promoting, all overall safety, both safety within the workforce, but also to the general public.
Right. And again, it goes back to that. It's a deterrent that, it's not going to happen overnight, but it will help deter those that use in the workplace. So when you do testing, like how frequent?
That really depends on sometimes the size of the company. But, frequency can vary, whether it's monthly, quarterly, semi-annually. But really, what works for that company, how, sometimes it's a matter of managing that program, where I have, our consortiums we do on a quarterly basis from a manageability standpoint. I have some private carriers program that would rather us do it monthly because it's easier for them to do smaller chunks throughout the year than having a bigger pool each time. But so it really depends, like I said, on the size of the pool, the goals. Really it's that best fit for that organization. But US DOT does mandate that it spread evenly throughout the year.
Right. You wouldn't necessarily want to do it once a year and it's done and there's no deterrent in those situations.
Exactly. I also, usually recommend not letting your employees always know, okay, this is how frequently we do it. And then even when you do the draws, it's not it's not always necessarily at the same time every period.
Right. We'll see clients that it's not the first of every month or the every Wednesday. It's, you got to change that up. That helps to, again, create that sense of without notice and element of surprise, but also that being that deterrent. So let's kind of dive into, you mentioned non-regulated and regulated. Let's talk just a little bit about non-regulated. And then we'll dig deeper into the regulated, since that is kind of a big thing, in that there is a huge, the whole regulated part of the workforce that is required.
Exactly.
But on the non-regulated side, can you just talk a little bit more about that?
Well, your non-regulated program is going to be dictated by a few different factors. One, what is the state regulations in the state or states that you are operating? There are some states out there that may prohibit random testing. And then it's going to be dictated by what your company policy is. Or if you do have some contracts that may state that you are required to test a certain percentage of your workforce. But you really must have a drug-free workplace policy that dictates, and outlines what that types of testing you're doing are. As I said, it doesn't necessarily have to state this is the frequency we do it, but it does. You really have to have a policy that states that your employees are subject to.
And really, which employees you mentioned earlier, like that you may only have certain categories of employees that are required to be tested, or you may be everybody.
A lot of companies, we kind of recommend that you really see it go from top to bottom of the company, that it is good for employees to see that upper management is actually subject to random testing too. It helps strengthen that program. It helps them realize that, yes, everybody is subject to it.
And held to the same standard.
Exactly. But we do see that some companies will then say, it is only for this classification or these classifications of employees. But your non-regulated testing, there's certain things that, because it's non-regulated, you do have a lot more flexibility in what you have in that. Some of that is, what type of testing are you doing? Is it drug only? Is it drug and alcohol? What substances are you testing for? Is it going to be urine? Is it going to be hair? Is it going to be oral fluid? For alcohol, is it breath out? Require breath alcohol testing. We see a lot of employers who do drug only and not random alcohol testing, just because the percentage of employees that do test positive for random is significantly smaller than drugs. But also, what's the frequency can dictate, how often you do it. As we've said, it really, so your non-regulated program, there's a lot more flexibility out there.
Exactly. So let's then dive into the federally regulated testing. As I mentioned, that's all the modes of transportation require a certain amount of random testing. So let's talk a little bit more about kind of what are the requirements for that and how companies need to manage that type of random programming.
So for federally regulated, you must, obviously you must have a DOT testing policy, and that outlines, who testing is required on, basically those safety sensitive employees, and then of course those federal regulations dictate the, who is considered safety sensitive. But as I mentioned earlier, you cannot include your non-regulated employees in a DOT testing pool. Now, I have some customers that will include besides having all of their DOT regulated employees in their DOT testing pool, they will also, on top of that, include their DOT employees in their non-regulated testing pool. That is allowed since that is the non-regulated testing pool, but you cannot put a non-regulated DOT regulated testing pool because that does what's considered dilute the testing pool.
One thing to kind of talk about in the difference between a DOT program and a non-DOT program is there is a DOT regulated test. Right now, DOT only allows for urine testing. However, they have approved oral fluid testing. It's just not been fully rolled out yet. That's still in the works. But whereas a non-regulated program can be, as you mentioned, any type of testing, and you can vary the drugs. The regulated testing, there are 5 drugs. It is regulated by the DOT. It is a special panel just for regulated testing.
Exactly. And like I said, so that's basically affecting, what mode. And then, of course, each mode can have slightly different regulations. So Federal Motor Carrier, Federal Transit Administration, Federal Aviation Administration, Federal Railway Administration all require random testing for both drugs and for alcohol. Whereas Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration and the United States Coast Guard only require random drug testing. They actually do not allow for you to do random alcohol testing. And then what the annual rates that you test, those percentages, are mandated by mode, and they can vary by mode. So one of the things we'll see is that under the federal regulations, there is a baseline that is mandated, which is in the regulations is 50% for drugs, 25% for alcohol. But those numbers can change each year based on the previous 2 years' positive testing rates for that specific industry. So currently, Federal Motor Carrier and Federal Transit Administration mandate that those safety-sensitive employees, that a company must meet 50% drug and 10% alcohol rates for the year. For Federal Aviation and under Federal Railways, both for maintenance away and covered service, it's 25% for drug, 10% for alcohol. But for the Federal FRA mechanical employees, it is currently at 50%, 25%. Why is it so much higher for that one classification? Is because the mechanical employees is actually a newer classification that is required, that fell under the being considered a safety-sensitive employee in the last 2.5 years. And as I mentioned before, that you have to have 2 full years of previous data to determine what the percentage for that year is. So they had to, so the mechanical employees had to go to the baseline, where I expect for 2026 that we are going to see a drop in those percentages. What that drop is going to be, I do not know. It may stay at 50% drug and go to 10% alcohol. It could go to 25% drug, depending what the previous 2 years survey was. But I do expect, like I said, that there will be a change, because now we do have, there is all of 2023 and all of 2024 data in there for that classification. But now, but where I said Pipeline and Coast Guard do not test for alcohol, but they do require 50%, random testing for drugs. But I said that number can vary annually. I don't expect to see the 2026 rate announcements to come out until sometime in December, and it really varies. Some modes will announce earlier in the month, and other ones will wait to the almost to the very end of the month of December to finally announce. Definitely stay tuned for that. I know we will definitely be announcing.
So when you're talking about these percentages that are required by modes, how do you calculate how many people you have to test, and how does that all work?
Basically, what the USDOT, all the modes look at is average number of employees in the pool. So if you're doing, say, quarterly draws, we're going to look at how many eligible employees did you have in the first quarter? How many eligible employees you had in the second quarter? How many in the third? And then how many in the fourth? Add that up, divide it by the number of selections, for the year. So as if it's quarterly, we're going to divide it by 4. And that will give you your average number.
And that total number that you're adding together each quarter, it's how many were in the draw or in the pool at the time of the selection.
Exactly. So it doesn't matter how many you have today. It's how many were in there at the time of the selection. And then when you do that number, you always need to round up. You cannot round down. You have to round up. So if I add the number of employees in each draw and it came out to, let's say, 28.2 employees, that means you have 29 employees on average.
A 0.2 person is a person.
Exactly. And then same thing is, you need to calculate the annual rate for that pool. So you're going to multiply the testing rate by the average number of employees in that pool. And I said, you're always, going to always round up to the number of tests required. So example, if I have a 25% annual testing rate, I have 29 employees. 25% times 29 comes out to 7.25. But basically that tells me I have to have 8 tests.
8 tests.
Because I am required to round up.
Right. So it's really important to do that calculation and hand calculate and make sure you're hitting that number. Because if you only do 7 tests and you need 8, you are out of compliance.
Exactly. Now, using an example our game years ago, that if I'm required to have 50% random testing, if I hit 49.9999%, I am out of compliance.
Right.
It has to meet or exceed, the number of tests you need. You cannot, being off by 0.00001 is out of compliance.
Right. So talked about the percentages, we talked about how we get there. Now, I'm a small company. Does every company have to meet those numbers? Or I hear the word consortium. What does that mean and how does that work?
So the U.S. Department of Transportation does allow for what's considered a consortium. A consortium basically is taking the safety sensitive employees from multiple companies and combining them into one single random testing pool for the purposes of meeting the random testing requirements for each of those employers. So basically, under the regulations, the consortium takes the place of the company. So a owner-operator, a one-person operation is mandated by federal regulations to be in a consortium. But a company, say, with 2 employees, technically can have what we consider a private pool, be in their own testing pool, or they can be in a consortium. But for a company that small, it is almost impossible to effectively manage your own program without completely over testing Because let's say if the federal requirements say for federal motor carriers 50% and 10%, well, that means, and I need to say I'm testing, semi-annually, because you still have to mix them up, evenly throughout the year. Well, then in effect, if I had 2 employees, now I am drawing one the first half of the year, one the second half of the year. And I said it could be the same employee. And then still trying to so I'm completely overdrawing where it's much more advantageous for a company to be what's in a consortium. But as I said before, the consortium takes the place of the company requirements. So the consortium like for federal motor carrier, if we're testing at 50% drug, 10% alcohol, the consortium as a whole needs to hit that 50% and 10%. So if
my company doesn't,
it does not need to be there. But on that same note, the entire consortium, if the consortium does not meet its 50 and 10%, then the majority of the consortium is going to be out of compliance because the consortium did not hit it. Now, could I say if a single company in there exceeded that number, chances are the US DOT will say, well, you met your numbers, your obligation, but it's possible that your employee does not get selected during the year. So the consortium needs to make sure it's on top of those numbers. So really, like I said, that consortium is a combined pool, whereas I said, it's a single random testing pool, which is a much larger testing pool, where all the required number of employees are randomly selected for that testing.
So a consortium, you're not administrating yourself, whereas a private pool, you could feasibly do your own private pool within. You don't need somebody to help you. Whereas a consortium, you are essentially hiring an administrative service.
For the most part, yes. Probably the one exception, I'll say, we have some clients that own multiple companies.
Sure.
Using an example is I have a FAA company that probably has a dozen different FAA companies underneath them. We can actually set up a consortium for just all of their companies combined, where we're not, so it's all under that one. So the one master company really has a consortium of their various companies combined, where they're not really relying on other companies that are unrelated to them.
Correct.
So it's possible to do that. But of course, on the whole, the majority of the consortium is going to be, a lot of unrelated companies.
So that private pool is either your own individual company, and that's good for larger companies.
Exactly.
Where you want to have that ultimate control over your regulatory compliance. But the consortium then is, again, bringing together other companies to help you reach those compliance.
Very much so. So in a private pool, we manage a lot of private pools for companies that, generally have enough employees to, really, to do those random selections on their own. So yes, a company has the ability to manage their own private pool, but also in many cases too, they're going to go with, they also will allow a third-party administrator to help manage that private pool, because a lot of companies still don't want to invest in the software that is needed. And plus, they like to also have that that a neutral third party doing the selections for them. That way, they cannot, they cannot have employees say, "Well, you are picking on need.
I think the big thing too in all of that is whoever is managing that random program is making sure that you're maintaining proper records of all of the things that that are required to do a random to make sure that you're still in compliance.
Exactly. And that's also why I said on the consortiums, it's very advantageous for a lot of these companies to be in a consortium. Because, and I even have some larger companies in our consortium too that have hundreds of employees.
Mm-hmm.
They would just rather be in a pool that has other companies' employees in it, because I said that consortium does allow for a lot of the administrative services, because consortium TPA manages that program, helps implement those policies. It performs those random selections for them to ensure compliance with the DOT. I'd say because compliance obviously is a huge piece in this, because basically by participating, that member company meets the regulatory obligations for random testing based on, upon the pool members, not their individual testing numbers. But again, like I said, it's also very important that those members of that consortium have to, comply.
Right.
And we do, and that's is a challenge we face as a consortium, is making sure that all of our members are, getting their employees in after they do a selection. But basically, as I kind of said, any size company can join a company to simplify the compliance, but those owner-operators are mandated by law to be in a consortium. But one thing we do run into, one of the common questions we get a lot of phone calls about, is FMCSA Clearinghouse, and people thinking that the FMCSA Clearinghouse is the consortium. The FMCSA Clearinghouse is not a consortium. FMCSA Clearinghouse is a database, administered by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration that's used for tracking drug and alcohol testing violations, which is used, complete for a different drug testing requirement. We'll talk about this in a future podcast, digging into the FMCSA clearinghouses, but the consortium is your random testing program that is taking multiple companies in their safety sensitive employees and combining them to one central pool. Now, like I said,
to meet those random testing requirements.
Exactly. Now, and the consortiums themselves we can combine different modes into a single consortium pool. For the most part, you want, for most modes, you really want to have your employees in a modal specific testing program. So your FMCS, your FMCSA employees are in a pool that is comprised of Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration regulated employers. Your FAA pool is strictly federal aviation. Pipeline, same thing. It is like I said, there are some rules that do allow for some crossover, but to really meet the requirement that you're trying to get, it is, you really want to have one. So yes, so like we as a CTPA manage multiple consortiums. We have a motor carrier consortium. We have an FAA consortium. We have a Federal Railway consortium. We have a pipeline consortium. We have a Coast Guard consortium. They are each managed separate.
And the key there is because of the different percentages that are required by each of those modes, it's important that the consortium that you are a part of is achieving those minimum requirements.
Yes, achieving those minimum requirements, those goals.
And we'll touch a little bit more on that after we kind of go through. But before we jump into what some of the different responsibilities within a consortium, can you talk a little bit about some of the different pricing and kind of schools of thought when it comes to consortiums, because there's a couple different ways that different companies, how they operate their consortiums.
Yeah, I mean, we generally will see, out there that there's really two major schools of thoughts. One is really paying by the test. So basically, you pay a annual fee to be part of that consortium, but then that consortium then charges you every random test that your employees take. The pro of this is you only pay for the test that you've actually been selected for. But the con of this is that your annual cost can vary based on how frequently you are selected.
Right.
So, I see a lot of companies out there that say, consortiums out there that are advertising a really low annual fee, but they they may overdraw their consortium significantly in order because they're getting paid by the test.
Right.
And then also it's possible that your employee, even if you're an owner operator, you may get selected more than once.
Right.
So all of a sudden, then you start realizing that you have start adding up how many tests did you get selected for. Say I got selected twice this year, and the consortium is charging you X number of dollars for that test. Plus, and maybe you got selected once for a breath alcohol test. Well, that cheap membership fee probably just added up very quickly. So you do, so I said a negative on that school of thought basically is there's an easy chance for over testing because, like I said, they are making their money by the test. Now, the other school of thought, and this is the school that we like to operate under, is that you pay an annual per employee fee, that all random testing is included in that fee. So generally that model includes a small administrative annual fee and then an annual per employee fee that includes all that testing. So the pro of this is you have a fixed annual cost that this is how much it's going to cost me for my random program this year. There's also less of a chance for over testing because at that point, the more the consortium overtests, it is
costing the consortium money.
It's costing the consortium money. But like I said, but also on that paper test model, you may pay a low amount, and if you don't get selected during the year, you ended up with that low amount. So there's definitely pros and cons to both. As I said, we like to operate under that your random testing is included because, like I said, it basically keeps us honest. By we draw what we know we're going to need for the year, not oversecting in being in business for almost 30 years, we've met our numbers every year. We will always exceed a little bit, but I'm not,
because again, we want to make sure that we hit that number, because if the consortium does not meet the requirement, it could mean that every one of those members is also not in compliance.
Exactly.
And as a consortium operator, we don't want that to happen. So it is important that the consortium meets those numbers. As we kind of go into this next section, let's talk a little bit about what some of the different responsibilities are, both for the consortium, for the DER, and for the employees, because there are specific things within the random program that are required at all levels. So let's kind of start with, since we're talking about the different types of consortiums, what is the responsibility of the consortium, that CTPA or consortia third-party administrator? What are their requirements?
Well, one of the things they actually have to do is they have to make sure they are maintaining the pool membership lists. They are regularly checking in with its members, those companies, to ensure accuracy of that list, because your list is only as good as the day that the selection happens. So, as a consortium, we send out list updates,
About once a month.
Usually about once a month, but also we make sure that we're sending it out very close to when we're going to do
Exactly.
we're actually going to do a draw, because that list is what is going to go by of who's in there, who is in that pool, is basically the DOT during an audit is going to say, okay, we're all your safety sensitive employees included in that pool, in that draw. So one of the things is we have to make sure that we are checking with our members on a regular basis to make sure that, yes, they do have an accurate list, in that we are maintaining that database. And that when they send us a change that we are making that change right away.
Right.
Second thing is that we have to make sure we are conducting random selections using a scientifically valid, proven method. Because yes, as a consortium, I can be audited by the different modes.
Right.
And I said, and ultimately, the consortium is basically taking the place of the company. So if the consortium is non-compliant, my member is non-compliant. So I cannot put my members in a state of being non-compliant.
Right.
So I have to make sure I'm using, what is required under the federal regulations. Also, I need to make sure I'm supplying my members with all the documentation they need for their audits. So I need to be able to produce a list of who was included in the pool at the time of each draw. I need to be able to show when somebody was added in the pool or removed from the pool. I need to show provide documentation of who was selected in each draw. I need to be able to show any documentation of excused tests. Is there a reason that we can excuse a test after it was drawn? Yes, there is. Generally, that if a employee is not going to be available to test in that selection period, maybe they're on a leave of absence, they are out on medical leave. In the cases, we'll see a little bit more with some of the FAA and the Coast Guard employers, that the subject employee is out of the country and not in a position where there is a collection site that meets DOT standards to get that test done. And if I can't get that person tested by the end of that selection period, there is a reason, or that once I did that draw, that same day, that employee left the company.
Right.
So there's times that we do have to excuse a test, but I need to have documentation of those excused tests. I also need to be able to produce all test results of all completed random testing, including the alcohol testing forms for all breath alcohol tests, and the chain of custody forms for all drug tests. Now, something very important here is when we're talking about, alcohol testing forms, because this is a problem that we see in the industry, is that US DOT, for all DOT regulated breath alcohol tests, test does not count unless I can produce that physical alcohol testing form. It does not matter if I can produce just the result, because using a lot of the electronic chain of custody and reporting collection software, we do find that a lot of collection sites, few too many, that their collector will put the result in the computer. They may do the alcohol testing form. They may or may not do the alcohol test, the federal alcohol testing.
Right.
They sometimes think, oh, I put it in the computer, that counts.
It does not.
It does not count. And then there's a requirement that once they do that alcohol, put it on the alcohol testing form, that they then send that result, the alcohol testing form, to the designated employer representative and hopefully also to the consortium.
Right.
But if we also find that sometimes people, some of the collection sites would say, "Oh, I did it," and then they did not retain the alcohol testing form, but they forgot to send it to anybody, or they just assumed somebody that they sent it and it never got sent.
And the key there is, as a consortium and as a company, you cannot count it if you do not have
alcohol
testing form. So, period. Doesn't matter if the test was done or not. If we do not have the form, it cannot count. The DOT will not recognize any form of result besides that alcohol testing.
And then something very important here is that the consortium can produce an annual summary report of the consortium numbers. That basically includes the average number of employees subject to testing in the entire pool, the total number of drug and alcohol tests that were completed, the percentage of drug and alcohol testing completed, and that annual report takes the place of an individual company requirement, including all members' information, not just your company. So when we say that the consortium takes the place of the company requirement, I, as a consortium, need to prove that by producing a report. It's amazing how many times I run into companies that say, "Hey, we were with this consortium, this other consortium, and they never gave me anything at the end of the year showing what the percentage was." And if I cannot prove by company that my consortium I was a part of met its numbers, then I very well may be out of compliance.
Right. And auditors can be very particular and they want the exact information. And so, yes, it is important when you're looking for a consortium that you are finding one that is giving you all of these things, making sure that they are able to produce for you in the event of an audit all of these different requirements that the consortium is maintaining.
It is amazing because I said, I know we, talking to a major employer locally, and they're talking to me about the documentation or lack thereof documentation that their consortium gave them. That if one of their employees if none of their employees were drawn in that selection, then they didn't produce to them a draw letter. So how do I prove I'm in the draw if I don't?
Right.
If I don't have notification that there was a draw letter showing that I was in there, or they cannot give me or they're like, that my consortium cannot give me a list of who was actually included in that selection.
Because it's not enough for the employer to say this is who was in on that day, because the consortium needs to be able to prove that all those people that you say were in on your side of the records that were working for you on that day, that they were actually in the draw. The consortium needs to be able to prove all of those things.
Very much so.
So let's touch on now, go into what is the DER, the Designated Employer Representative's responsibility, or basically the company's responsibility when it comes to random testing.
Well, one, they need to make sure they are maintaining a current and accurate pool membership list with the consortium. So all employees who are subject to random testing from the date they start performing safety-sensitive duties, and that employee must have a negative pre-employment drug test result, has to be in that pool. So if I hired a new employee yesterday and I am doing my random draw today, that employee who started yesterday better be included in that random draw.
But if they started yesterday, you cannot start them until they actually have that negative pre-employment.
You cannot have a negative. Yeah, you cannot start them until they have that negative pre-employment test. But
once they officially start.
But once they start, if they start performing safety sensitive duties, and if they start performing safety sensitive duties yesterday, I do my draw today.
They need to be
in that pool. It doesn't matter that they tested negative on a pre-employment 2 days ago. If they
are doing the work.
If they are doing the work, they need to be, and I've seen companies cite it because they did not make sure that that employee they hired last week was in the pool. So just because I updated my random list with my consortium last week and I have not received that draw notification, I better make sure that if all of a sudden one of my employees left me or that I've put on a new employee, that I've updated my consortium to make sure that they are in that pool. Now, as a best practice as a consortium, we have it in our system that anytime a company has a negative pre-employment drug test, they auto add into our consortium pool. They are a consortium member. Because a best practice is to include someone, is better to include an employee who has not started yet in that pool than to exclude somebody who has started.
Because again, if you miss it, even by a day, you can be cited.
And those fines can be hefty.
Right.
Technically, the DOT, any of the modes can fine a company up to $10,000 per violation per day. It's rare you ever see that big of but a couple $1,000 per violation, fine is very common.
And again, that's where it's important that DER is in constant contact with their consortium, making sure that new employees are being added and notifying that consortium when employees leave, that you're keeping that list as accurate as possible throughout, but then also being able to review that list before a draw to make sure that everyone that is supposed to be there is in there, and anyone who is not supposed to be in there has been removed.
Exactly. And part of this too is that when you get your, say your pre-employment drug test results, you should review all your drug test results to verify that the employee has the correct mode and the correct occupation classification are listed correctly. And because these are things that can be corrected by an affidavit, but here's an issue that I've seen before, say with an FAA company.
Mm-hmm.
That you got a lot of collectors just because 90% of all safety sensitive employees are motor carriers. I've seen collectors just check FMCSA on everybody. But then, so if I get pre-employment drug test and the collector mischecked the mode that person is, and the company did not catch that the person was in the wrong mode, that our system, let's say when they auto add them into the pool, well, they're auto adding them into the pool for what that pre-employment drug test showed. So if I have an FAA company that had a test that was the employee pre-employment was marked FMCSA, well, that member is not in our FMCSA pool.
Right.
So that employee got excluded because no one caught that they were marked as FMCSA and not FAA, which then could cause a fine, a citation. So it is important that the DER, who's receiving the results, are reviewing the results to make sure that the correct mode is checked. Also, we need to make sure the correct occupation is checked. It doesn't really matter as much, that somebody's going to be selected in the random pool, but we also have to do end of the year statistical reports. In statistical reports, the MIS reports are occupation specific. So like a mode like FMCSA, there is only one occupation, but Federal Transit Administration, Federal Aviation Administration have multiple occupational classifications. So we need to make sure that, everybody is classified properly.
Right. And those annual statistical reports are showing how many tests were done by mode and by those occupation classifications, because that can result, like with FRA, you have a number of different classifications of employees and the percentages that they test, and modes can make split apart and have different requirements. So it's important that those numbers, again, where we were talking about how are the percentages for modes created, they're looking at that statistical data on an annual basis.
Exactly. And then, of course, one of the other requirements for that designated employer representative is to ensure that all of their drug and alcohol tests are completed within the testing period. What that means is if you're doing quarterly draws, that by the end of that testing quarter, that anybody that was selected was tested. And if they're not tested, that there's documentation of why they were excused. A company can be cited for not testing their employees that were selected unless they did not keep proper documentation in there of why somebody was excused. And when you're keeping that documentation and you're excusing somebody, you need to make sure it is a valid reason that they were not tested. You can't, in one common one, I hear is somebody say, well, that person, was selected last quarter, so I didn't feel I needed to test them again. No, every time that they are drawn, they are required to be tested. And it doesn't matter, yes, that person tested last selection period too. If they were selected more than once in that year, they are required to be tested.
The other part of that is like we'll hear, oh, well, they were on vacation or they were out sick. Okay, but you have the entirety of the selection period, which, like where we're doing quarterly randoms, you have 3 months to get this person tested. So they're on vacation for 2 weeks. They're probably going to be back before the end of that testing period. And that's one thing where the DER can hold notification of that test.
Exactly. So yes, the DER basically is, they're the gatekeeper here. We are notifying the DER of when the test is, not notifying the actual employee of the test. The DER can hold that notification for as long as they need to get that person to determine when is the
optimal time.
When is the optimal time? When is the safe time that they can get that person tested? Because using the trucking analogy, if that driver is under a hot load that has to be delivered tomorrow and I cannot afford to stop that truck,
right?
I can hold, as DR, I can hold that notification until I know that person has adequate time to go get tested. Let them finish their hot load.
Right.
And then notify when they can safely do it. But when I'm notifying, there's a couple key things there. One, they need to be on duty, either immediately. I can either catch them as they're coming on shift in the middle of their job duty or immediately following them going off duty.
Right, at that end of the day.
End of the day. I cannot call them on their day off, send them in for testing. So that is very important that we need to make sure. But here's a common myth out there is, and let me just state this first, is once you notify your employee of testing, they have to immediately proceed to the testing site. The myth I've heard so many times is, oh, that employee has 2 hours to get that test done. No. once you notify the employee, they have to immediately proceed to the collection site. Do not stop go. Do not collect $200.
Exactly.
They need to immediately proceed. And so you need to look at when you're going to notify somebody, and then where is that collection site, and then calculate how much time from where that person is can they safely get to that collection site. So yes, there are cases that somebody may have 2 hours of notification because they are 2 hours in the middle of nowhere, and the closest collection site is 2 hours away. Right. But of course, I'm probably not going to advise that I'm going to tell that employee until they get closer to that collection site, and then say, okay,
now go.
Also, do not just say, first thing this morning, say, hey, I need you to get tested when you get off of shift today. I cannot give somebody all day.
Right.
Once you notify them, they have to immediately proceed. You as a company can be cited and fined for allowing your employee to give them notification that where they are not immediately proceeding. And if they do not immediately proceed to that collection site, that can be considered a refusal to test.
Right. And the key there, though, too, is from a DER perspective, is making sure that you are giving that employee enough time to complete that test. Important thing to remember is an employee, once they have reported for that test and started the testing process, they have 3 hours to provide an adequate specimen. Say they have a shy bladder or, can't provide a sufficient quantity, they have to stay at that facility for up to 3 hours. So when you are sending your employee, you need to make sure that they don't have somewhere else that they need to be an hour from now, or
if they cannot provide that sample at the time they show up, they are required to be there for up to 3 hours. And if they leave that facility prior to the 3 hours without providing that specimen, that could be considered a refusal to test under the DOT regulations.
Right.
On the note of refusal to test, it's also, when I said the DER is the one who makes that determination of what a refusal to test is and who's giving that notification. In the case of an owner-operator, the consortium is the DER. They take that. So if a member does not get tested, an owner-operator does not get tested within that testing period, the consortium can report that
as a refusal.
As a refusal to the DOT mode. If it is an FMCSA employee, that can be reported to the FMCSA clearinghouse. If that person is an FAA Part 63 medical certificate holder, that can be immediately reported to the FAA for non-compliance. Also as a consortium, I also have an obligation to remove companies from the pool for non-compliance. If we see members that are just constantly
never test,
we send them their notifications, talk to them, we call them up, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I got the notification that we were selected, but I'm not going to test." I can,
as a consortium,
I can go remove them because they are putting the rest of my members out of compliance.
Exactly.
So we have and will remove companies for non-compliance in the testing pool.
So you touched a little bit on kind of that employee responsibilities, because there are things that the employee themselves are responsible for when it comes to random testing. We talked about how, once they report for that test, one, they need to proceed immediately, and then they have up to 3 hours to provide that adequate specimen once they have reported. But there's other things that they are required.
But the key there is they have to immediately proceed to the collection site. Once they start that collection at the collection site, then they have 3 hours. It's not that they have 3 hours to get to the site.
Correct.
So as I said before, once a employee is notified, they have to immediately proceed to the collection site. And that means they proceed now, not the end of the day, not by a certain time, not when you are free.
Not on your lunch break.
It is once you are told, you have to immediately proceed. And if you do not immediately proceed to that collection site when the DER tells you that you were selected and you have to go right now, that could be considered a refusal to test. And there's implications because it can be, a refusal to test is treated the same as a positive test. And they must remain at that collection facility even if they have not started the test yet. So once they are told to show up to that collection site, if they say, hey, I need to go before they ever got called back, no, because they have to immediately get that test done, they have to stay at that collection site until that test has been started and until they can provide that sample.
Exactly.
And then, like I said, we said that they have 3 hours to provide the adequate sample after the first attempt is made. But they need to understand it is considered a refusal test if they do not report to the testing immediately upon notification, and if they leave that collection facility prior to completing that test. And they are responsible for ensuring all tests are completed, both the drug and the breath alcohol. It's not the responsibility of the collection site and of the collector to make sure all tests have been completed. It's something that it's a problem we run into quite, unfortunately, too frequently, is that the collection site did not look at the authorization form and say thoroughly enough and say, oh, this person was selected for both a drug test and for a breath alcohol test, and they only did the drug test. It is the employee's responsibility before they leave that collection site to ensure that they got both that drug test and that breath alcohol test done if they were selected for both.
Right. And it goes back to where the DER needs to make sure that that employee knows what tests they are supposed to have or be taking, so that, again, that employee then makes sure that happens once they arrive at the site.
If the employee leaves that facility without getting all tests completed, it could be considered as a refusal to test.
Exactly.
And trust me, I have seen auditors from different modes cite companies for not ensuring that their employee got all tests completed. They do not care that the collector did not read that authorization. It is in the view of all those auditors that it is the employee's responsibility, not the collector's responsibility, to ensure those tests, were completed.
So I think in all of this, it is really important that the consortium has requirements, the designated employer representative has requirements, and even the employee has requirements to make sure that all of the proper testing is being completed. Now, we've taken the test. Are there types of tests that we can count or can't count? Are there, some of those kind of unusual results that we see sometimes, like a dilute specimen or a fatal flaw? How does all of that work in terms of meeting those regulations?
Well, dilute tests, both positive and negative dilute tests, are valid results and only require retesting if it is a case of a super dilute.
What does that mean?
Which is where an MRO, basically, the laboratory does validity testing on all specimens. They are making sure that there's both that human body produces a certain amount of acidity in a urine specimen and also a certain amount of creatine in every urine specimen. And if those numbers are too high or too low, that it could be considered what's considered a dilute specimen. In some cases where that number is so far off, basically it is not possible for a human to produce a sample with such such
with those
little,
numbers.
such little, it's at that case, the medical review officer, but the laboratory is going to report that out as a super dilute. The MRO, medical review officer, is going to review that and generally concur that yes, this probably is either somebody did something to that specimen, whether they dipped it in something, they produced a sample that was not actually urine,
right?
That in that case, where they cannot conclusively say this is a negative test or a positive test, but it's also that it is questionable whether this is even urine, that the medical review officer can request immediate recollection under a direct observation situation. In that case, but I said a dilute sample, still, if it's just a regular dilute, it will count toward.
It is a result.
It is a result.
The super dilute, though, would require a second test, and then that second test result is the result that we would count towards a percentage.
Now, in cases that say there was an error, a collector error, it was lost in transit, the test was canceled for any reason. Basically, it was a fatal flaw. Something happened.
Out of the control of that donor.
Yeah, out of the control of the donors, not the fault of that donor. That basically a company cannot count that as
towards our percentage.
As a percentage, but also they cannot send that donor back in again, as that employee was already notified of that random test. They met their obligation.
Right.
So that test is going to get excused. It cannot count toward their annual percentages because there was no specimen tested. And so that test is going to have to get made up by somebody else.
Right.
Whether they allow for alternates or basically the consortium overdrew enough to account for those types of situations. For those tests, because in the case of, say, an owner operator, I don't have an alternate.
Right.
But then there's also what's considered an invalid test. Issues, inconsistencies with the specimen provided by the donor from the lab. In that case, they must be recollected per the medical review officer instructions, usually under direct observation. But an invalid test does not count toward the annual percentage. We can only count the valid retest.
Right.
But a refusal to test, where the donor does not report to the testing or leaves the facility without completing the test, that is considered a test.
That's a result.
It is a result. A refusal is a result. That does count towards your annual minimum percentages.
And when it comes to refusals, the DOT treats a refusal like they treat a positive test. It would require that substance abuse program follow-up, that whole process, correct?
Correct.
And again, that refusal can count. So, in some of these situations, and we've talked previously a little bit about excusing a donor, because it does happen where there are occasions when we need to excuse a donor, and there are approved reasons. The DOT does recognize there are certain times when you must.
Exactly. And the biggest thing here is documentation.
Exactly.
You must properly document why you are excusing a donor, and make sure that you're keeping this in your employee records, your drug testing records, and also that let your consortium TPA know that documentation. Provide them the documentation that person is being excused, because then also by letting them know, they also will stop reminding you of, hey, this test has not been done.
Exactly.
But what are reasons that we would, valid reasons to excuse a test? One, employee's no longer employed by you. They leave you.
Obviously, you can't test them.
You can't test them. You can't say, oh, you no longer with, but you were drawn, so go in for a test. No. They are no longer employed by you. If an employee is on an extended leave of absence, such as a medical leave, out of the country, and they will not be returning within that testing period, you can excuse them from that. Or if that employee is no longer working in a safety sensitive role.
Right. We see that, frequently where all of a sudden their job changed and now you have them doing different duties that isn't requiring them fall under those required testing requirements.
So yeah, that's definitely, and then, one of the things we're definitely looking at here is that there are times that we say it should be done within that testing period. Now, will the DOT allow for that test to count if you tested them in the following testing period? Yes, they will actually, if you actually had them tested before the end of that calendar year, the DOT generally will accept that test.
Right.
But
again, documentation.
But also it needs to be within that calendar year.
Correct.
So I can't take a fourth quarter draw and test them in the first quarter of the following year.
Yeah, I can't test them in January.
I can't test them on January the 1st.
Right.
December 31st, all that testing needs to be completed.
Exactly. How about using alternates then? If I'm excusing people, can I use alternates?
Yes. DOT does allow for alternates, but honestly, I get a lot of auditors tell me they don't love the use of alternates, but it is allowed. And sometimes there's restrictions to using alternates because if we have an alternate, say if it's an owner-operator, there is no alternate.
Right.
Who if there's only a one-person operation, who am I going to use as an alternate? But even in a case of a small company, I can only use alternates that were included in that draw.
In that random.
In that random draw. I can't use a new employee who was hired after the selection as an alternate. And then if I'm a small company, is that really discrimination against somebody who is, I only have 2 employees. This person's not available anymore. So now that person is going to get tested. So use of alternates is generally, is it allowed? Yes. Is it the preferred method? No, it is not. They can only be used if the original employee is excused for a proper reason. And that CTPA should provide alternate names until original employee, until an original employee is excused. Meaning, I cannot give you upfront the list of alternates.
Right.
I can only provide you an alternate name after we excused that employee.
Exactly.
I have some companies say, "Well, no, just give me my alternates up front." Yeah, sorry, we cannot do that.
Right.
Because now they're basically can say, "Well, I think that person
I want that person
already.
tested
I want that
instead.
person." And then I can't just say, "Okay, here's your list of alternates."
Right.
Pick which one you want.
No,
I'm going to have to give you a very specific name of this person was excused. This person is your alternate.
The important key there is it is the CTPA who provides that alternate. The company can't pick and choose. They have to take the next name on the list that the CTPA provides. And that's important to...
So sometimes where it's more preferred just to overdraw the consortium a little bit to allow that, knowing that there's going to be a certain amount of excused employees for every draw.
Exactly. So what happens if you fail to test? That you don't send your employees in?
Well, again, the consortium takes the burden of meeting the compliance requirement in order for all members to meet the federal compliance guidelines. So every test matters. Failing a test can have compliance implications for both your company, but also for the entire consortium. Do not wait until the very end of the testing period to send your employees in to testing. As a consortium, things that make me
Want to scream?
Really want to scream is that the very last week of of the quarter that everybody's trying to send their employees in for testing then instead of
right. And as we're going into the end of the year, I mean, that important thing to remember is you have until December 31st. If you test your employee on January 1st, it does not count. You failed to get that person in and within the testing period and within the calendar year.
And as we get to the holiday season, this is very important because a lot of employees like to take off for the holidays, or many companies close for the holidays.
And not just your company might close for the holidays, but so do collection sites. Collection sites are closed on those major holidays, and sometimes that week between Christmas and New Year's. You need to make sure that you are getting your people in timely, and our favorite consortium members are those that as soon as they get that notification, they get their employees in.
And, and you need to be able to explain to an auditor why you waited and needed to excuse a test. And that's an issue we see, is that companies, they wait. And the problem is during that period after that selection, how many employees decided to leave, or there was a reduction in workforce. Now these employees who were selected are no longer with you. Now you still need to meet your random percentages for the year.
Right.
How that makes it more difficult when you are allowing you keep that you have a tendency to wait until the end of that testing period. Now, how many of those employees are no longer with you? And now explain that to the auditor of, I had that list all quarter, and I decided to wait, and these people are no longer with me. That does not look good in a audit.
Right, because that employee worked for you for 2 months and you didn't get them tested. And then when you finally decided to test, now they don't work for you anymore. That auditor is going to say, you had 2 months. Why didn't you test them? So again, test early, get them, get those tests done. Don't put it off is the key, because it can have implications, not just for you, but for the consortium, and also in an audit, it can have negative implications.
And you got to remember, we said it earlier that for owner operators, the consortium acts as the DER, and the consortium can report an owner operator who fails to complete a test as a refusal to test, which can shut that employee down until they complete that substance use professional plan.
Exactly.
And in the case of an FMCSA, their driver's license, their commercial privileges are being suspended if we report a refusal to the clearinghouse. And then again, also, I said consortiums and TPAs can remove companies from the consortium pool for noncompliance with testing.
And I will say, consortiums don't want to go to those measures. However, again, we're taking on that burden of compliance for all of our members, and we have to do what we need to do to make sure that consortium meets those numbers. So, company and employee participation is critical to make sure that a consortium performs at its best. So, as we kind of finish up, let's touch on a few of those unique situations where a company might have employees that fall under multiple modes, or employees themselves fall under multiple modes. How does all of that work in this whole testing requirements? Do I have to be, if I'm in multiple modes, do I have to be in multiple pools? How does all of that work?
Not necessarily. They may be both. The majority of their operation is they are operating a backhoe, or a crane around pipeline.
Right.
But then to get that crane, to get that backhoe out, to that job site, they also have to have a CDL license and operate a commercial motor vehicle. So they're falling under both FMCSA and pipeline.
Right.
Or, I've have, in cases of some FAA companies that maybe the pilot also on occasion will drive the fuel truck.
Right.
So they're falling under both motor carrier and FAA regulations. So there are cases, but basically what the DOT allows for is you can either keep them in both testing pools. You have one in one mode's pool and one in the other mode. But more importantly, they actually allow you to be in a single testing pool. And there's two ways you can look at that. One is you either put them in the pool with the greatest random percentage. So if I have somebody who's both motor carrier and FAA, whereas FMCSA tests at 50% for drug and 10% for alcohol, whereas FAA only tests for 25% drug and 10% alcohol, I could put that employee in with the FMCSA pool, which tests at that greater percentage, and that will meet the requirement
for both.
The other thing is that the mode will look at where you could put them in the testing pool where the majority of their duties fall under. So if somebody, such as like that pilot, he's 90% of his safety sensitive duties is operating that plane, and it's only 10% driving that fuel truck, it is actually acceptable to put them in the FAA testing pool that tests at that lower rate, because the majority of their duties fall under that one.
Under FAA.
But there are exceptions to that where you really do need to have that employee in multiple pools. Example is we had a client that was, it was very unusual. They were in both both FAA regulated because they were a pilot, but part of their duties was they were doing inspections on pipelines, aerial inspections on pipelines. They also fell under the pipeline regulations. The issue we got into there is that pipeline and Coast Guard do not allow for your employees to have random alcohol testing. The only time that it is allowed is if they are an employee who does fall under multiple modes where alcohol testing is allowed. So in an example that, say, I have some clients where I kind of talked about was where they fall under motor carrier and pipeline, that they have some employees who are motor carrier only. They do not fall under, they are not considered safety sensitive under pipeline. But that same company will then have another classification set of employees fall under, considered safety sensitive for both motor carrier and for pipeline. And then they will have a third classification of employee that only does pipeline, that are only pipeline. They do not operate the trucks. They're not motor carrier. In that case, I can take the FMCSA employees and the employees that fall under both FMCSA and pipeline and put them in my FMCSA testing pool, because they're both testing at 50% for drug, but because the motor carrier is testing the 10% alcohol. But my pipeline employees or pipeline only have to be in a pipeline only pool, because I cannot subject them to random alcohol testing.
I think the key in all of this is you really need to, when you have unique situations like this, you need to be talking to your CTPA, your consortium, or talking to the DOT to get that clarification, to make sure you understand and have your employees being tested in the proper manner, because it is very complicated and can get.
It is, and like I said, in the case of say I have a FAA employee who is also subject to the pipeline. Well, in effect, I really had to have them in two separate pools,
right?
Because under FAA, I need 25% drug, 10% alcohol. Under pipeline, I need 50% drug. So unless I all of a sudden put that employee in a pool that is not FAA or pipeline, but more like my FMCSA pool, that is 50 and 10,
right?
I couldn't,
Again, it gets complicated.
But I can also take two modes that have the same testing rate, such as motor carrier and federal transit, and I can combine them into one single pool because they're both meeting the same
exact
testing rate. Or I could take, if I have a company that has a combination of both motor carrier and FAA, I could put them in one single pool, but testing them at the higher testing rate, the FMCSA's testing rates.
Right.
So I can always exceed my testing rates.
Right.
I cannot go under my testing rates, required testing rates, but I have to look at, those modes such as pipeline and Coast Guard of, am I allowed to do random alcohol testing?
So one more scenario to look at is I have sister companies, and we share employees. Do I have to have a program for each company, or can I combine them?
Honestly, it really depends on the mode. Federal Motor Carrier, Coast Guard, Pipeline pretty much allow employees to be tested under a single company. The FAA really are very clear that they will not allow for that. So examples is, kind of help understand what this issue really is let's say I have two trucking companies, and this company's slow today. So I'm going to take those same drivers and I'm going to lend them to my other company.
Mm-hmm.
The same. So two different companies are using the same set of drivers.
Right. Do I need pre-employments for both companies, or?
I do need pre-employments for both companies, but I can keep them in a single random testing pool, that will meet the percentages. But now if I get to FAA, the employees must complete the required pre-employment testing and be included in the pools for both companies. I can, so in effect, they are being double dipped.
Okay.
I cannot use the random testing program for this other company to be in compliance with this company.
Got it.
But an exception to that is a company can petition FAA drug abatement to apply for permission to combine the programs. But the key is you have to apply for that waiver and have that in writing that they are allowing you to do it. Without something in writing from FAA drug abatement, you have to have them in same employees in two separate pools.
Well, that is great. I think we covered a lot today on random testing and consortiums and kind of all those obligations and requirements. I think it's been very interesting and enlightening to kind of know all the ins and outs of those programs.
And we thank you all for joining us today.